Chapter 13. There were several streets down by the time Liska and Michaeline had stopped dragging Durin along and paused to catch their breath. "What?" Liska gasped, doubled over, her hands on her knees, and her ears plastered back against her head in a manner that made her narrowed eyes look all the more dangerous as she glared daggers at him. "And the goddess's thrice damned hell was that?" Michaeline asked, finishing Liska's words for her. He was also winded and panting, but nowhere near as much as she was. "What?" Durin said, looking back and forth between the two of them. Their expressions conveyed that they were quite displeased with him, but he couldn't for the life of himself figure out what had made them upset. "You broke Master Lufus's prized sword. He keeps that one out there on display. He's always boasted that he was going to pass it down as an heirloom to his firstborn," Liska practically shouted at him. "It was a goddess damn mastercraft blade," Michaeline said. It was the first time he had seen the man so flustered, other than when he had first met him, that was. "No, it wasn't." Durin shook his head. "That wasn't any more of a master-crafted blade than I am a kobold." He looked at them, and they obviously weren't believing him, so he decided to show them. "Look, Liska, your blade and mine are master-crafted swords." He pulled the sword out of the sheath and put the tip in the dirt next to his foot. There was a very easy way to quickly tell how durable a sword is. And their eyes widening, as he placed his foot in the centre of the sword blade and pushed down. The blade recessed for a moment before it flexed, first at an acute angle, before it curved itself into a rounded right angle. Then he bent it past, making sure to show that the blade could flex like that. As soon as he stepped back, it snapped back true. Not a single bend to be found. He held up the blade and showed them. "I didn't even get a quarter of the way before the blade failed at a critical weakness. If it really was a masterwork blade, then it would have at least neared a right angle and been true when it was released. A blade must have some flexibility if it is to have any sort of cutting ability. The only time a sword should break under that little exertion is if it was a dedicated frosting sword like an estoc or something." They both stared at him. Well, as a sword, as though it was either a snake or it was made of gold, or perhaps a golden snake. He slid it home in the sheath and lifted the belt holding it, adjusting it so that it rested comfortably on his hips again. "Could my sword do that?" Liska asked, and Durin looked at her. "Most likely," he said with a shrug. "I doubt I would be able to do that to it, though," he said. And she gave him a questioning look, so he went on to explain. "Well, my blade is a two-handed sword blade, a greatsword to be exact, which puts it at a length longer than even a standard longsword. That means I can apply more leverage on it, due to the length of the blade." "Oh," she said, and to Durin she sounded a little dejected. "If you want, we might be able to do it if Michaeline helps. The both of us could stand on the blade and pull on the hilt together between the two of us." "No," she said, quickly waving her hands. The idea of two people standing on the blade of her sword and attempting to bend it caused real worry in her. "So that was what you did?" she asked, looking at him. "Tested the blade's flex?" "Yeah, it was severely lacking," Durin said with a nod. "Durin," Liska sighed, shaking her head at him. "You can't just go around breaking other people's things," she said. Durin thought about it for a moment and then nodded his agreement to her statement. "I really didn't mean anything by it. I never intended to break the sword. I just didn't expect it to be so shit," he sighed, shaking his head at the poor excuse for a blade. "I'll have to go apologize, of course," he said, turning to head back towards the forge. Before he could even take a single step back, however, Liska had her hand on his arm and was once again steering him down the lane, away from the smithy. "We will have to do that later, perhaps when he has calmed down," she said, as he was about to argue that it was always best to clean the wound as soon as possible, or it might fester, which was how the old man had said you needed to make things right before they got worse, as they would with time, but she continued talking. "After all, we need to get the brooches still, and I want to go visit Solvi before we head to the Order's Hall." "Solvi?" Durin asked, knowing that the name sounded familiar but unable to place where he had heard it before. My friend Solvi, she was the woman you saved from the Cyclops," Liska explained. "Ah," Durin nodded. "She was pretty badly injured. Do you think she'll be conscious already?" "No, and even if she is, she will likely be in a drug-induced stupor to block the pain for the next week or so from what Michaeline told me. Likely won't even notice we are there, but still, I would like someone to come and visit me if the situations were reversed, whether I remember it or not." He looked at Liska and then nodded. "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea to me." The shop they went into for the brooches almost exclusively worked on them. They made everything from large ornate items in gold to small clasps made of steel. The shop itself was small but seemed neatly arranged. The couple that ran it were elderly and seemed both comfortable in their roles as shopkeepers, as well as man and wife, so much so they would sometimes even finish each other's sentences. As soon as Durin and Liska walked through the door, the old woman was all over them, pulling them over to have a look at them. The thing that made Durin smile the most at the two of them was the fact that they bantered as naturally as he breathed. That, and the matter of the fact was that neither of them attempted to push any merchandise off on them. Rather, they allowed Lysica and him to look at all the pieces, only supplying information if asked. It was almost like they didn't actually care whether they spent their coin here. It seemed more important to the shopkeepers that they found exactly what they were looking for. Durin let Lysica pick this one out, as he had chosen the tassets. In the end, she went with one that was almost identical to the tasset, but smaller, and with a slightly different profile. It was still a hexagon, but this one looked more like an arrow, if you asked Durin. He pinned hers on her chest, just above the left breast, sliding the tin metal pin in through the blue leather of the Order's cloak. She did the same, as he had wondered if she had noticed how his hands had trembled slightly when he had put hers in. "There," she said with a sigh, as all three of them stepped out of the shop and back into the street. "It's official now." "I thought it was official as soon as I won the jewel," Durin said, crossing his arms over his chest. She narrowed her eyes at him and mirrored his posture, also crossing her arms, though hers had to go under her chest, seeing as her breasts got in the way of truly crossing them over her chest, which was a fact that did not go unnoticed by Durin. "It was, and I gave my word. But don't push your luck, Durin." She leaned forward. "Accidents can happen, you know." Her voice was low and had attempted to be intimidating, but Durin simply shrugged it off. "If you were that sort of character, you would not have honored the agreement," he said with a shrug. "But you did, so I plan on sleeping soundly with the knowledge that you won't stab me as I dream." She didn't really know how to answer that. It was sort of a compliment, but in a roundabout sort of way. She didn't really know what to say. The trip to the Healer's Hall was located almost exactly in the center of Kadala. This made it equally accessible to all parts of the city, which had likely been the intent. It was called a hall, and there was a large two-story structure that could fit the description for sure, but the majority of the hall was actually made up of small single-room structures where the patients were housed. The healers, men and women dressed in white, would go to the houses scheduled, and minders, who were dressed in blue robes, would go from room to room, periodically checking on the patients. Solvi's room was one of the ones closer to the hall proper, which meant that she was a more serious case that required more medical attention, as the further the building was away from the hall proper, the longer it took for a healer to arrive there. Kadala's Healer's Hall was fortunate. They had on staff an actual mender, though her services were quite costly, as her skills were only used in the most extreme of cases, or if the patient was willing to pay the exorbitant fees associated with magical healing. Magic itself was a rarity, and one that was not natural to human beings. There was no such thing as a born mage. Magic came from monsters. Most medicines came from them as well. It was one of the reasons the Order of Odin was so highly regarded. Not only did they keep people safe, clear the roads and the like, but most creatures they hunted could be used to make tonics, salves, potions, and panaceas, all of which had amazing properties. It was often joked that the best food in a city could not be found in a restaurant, but rather at the Healer's Hall. Some ingredients from particular monsters did more than bolster health and strengthen the immune system. Some, when mixed in just the right ways, could do things to a person. That was how menders and other mages were made. Consumption of particular tonics or concoctions of ingredients would very rarely cause a person to do things no one had ever been able to fully understand or explain. Magic, it was called. And though people often attempted to replicate the events leading up to the creation of a magus, they never were able to succeed. After all, if it was as simple as drinking a particular potion, then receiving magic abilities, there would be many, many more mages out there in the world, no matter how prohibitively expensive such an elixir was. It didn't work that way, however. Each person was different. Each person reacted differently to things, so a panacea that gave one man the ability to heal others with a wave of his hand might simply promote a feeling of wholeness in others. Of course, there were the mainstays that affected everyone more or less the same way, like salves made from the powdered beak of a cockatrice, always healed wounds quickly and staunched bleeding. Not all ingredients from a monster were beneficial, however. Most of them, in fact, were not. They could cause madness or even death if consumed. Not that such stopped people from attempting to become mages. And then there were the potential overdoses issues, as spells required the user to ingest the ingredients, most of which were not particularly healthy to consume, some being poisonous even, or having adverse effects on the body, the more you consume. It meant that it was not uncommon for a mage to die of an overdose, or to go stark and raving mad. Which is why Kadala's mender was so pricey. Not only were her talents rare, not only were the ingredients needed for her to do her magic expensive and hard to acquire, but there was also a significant risk to herself every time she did magic. The three of them went into Solvi's room, and right away, Lysica rushed to her side, her hands out like she wanted to grab her, but they stopped, hovering over her friend's limp form like she was afraid that if she touched the other woman, she would break her. Slowly her hands reached up and started stroking Solvi's hair, brushing it out of the way as she softly whispered words to her as she cried softly. Duran watched Lysica for a moment before quietly catching Michaeline's eyes and motioning him out to speak where they wouldn't disturb the two women. As they got outside and Michaeline closed the door with a sigh and a sad shake of his head, Duran leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Michaeline joined him, the soft sound of Lysica's tears audible, even though they had shut the door behind them. "What are the chances of her making a full recovery?" Duran asked, looking over at Michaeline, who shook his head again. "Good. They are good. We got her back in time, but the chances of her doing order work again is slim to none, I am told. Not with other Mender's magic." "And why don't we do that?" Duran asked, an eyebrow raised. Michaeline looked at him surprised for a moment before answering. I don't think you realize how expensive that is," he said, slowly. "Her family is commoners. They don't make that sort of money, not in their lifetime. We are talking like 5 or 6 ticks, Duran." "Oh," Duran said. "Yeah," Michaeline nodded in understanding. Duran might have pulled out 5 or so ticks before, but Michaeline was no stranger to boasting, especially not in front of a woman you liked. No doubt Duran's display had been made to impress Lysica. He doubted Duran had any more money. That was likely all he had to his name. "I'll handle it then," Duran said, pulling off his pack and kneeling to pull out the coin purse again. "What?" Michaeline tried to speak, but his brain shut down as he watched Duran pull out a few gold coins and adding them one after another to the leather thong on his wrist. In the end, it only cost 3 ticks, much less than Michaeline had predicted, likely due to Solvi's condition not being critical. The mender was a kindly woman in her 30s, still beautiful, but with a dignified bearing. "The process will likely take somewhere near a month, but I can assure you that she will be fully healed," she had said, taking the money and depositing it in a lockbox. "Good," Duran nodded. "When are you going to start on it?" he asked, and the mender smiled. "Why don't we start now?" she had asked, and the 3 of them had made their way back to Solvi and Lysica. Duran and Michaeline waited outside as the mender entered. There were a few minutes of conversation before Lysica stepped out of the building using the back of her hand to wipe away tears. She looked at the 2 of them first, at Duran, then at Michaeline. "Don't look at me," Michaeline said. His hands open, always like he was surrendering. "It was moneybags over there." He pointed at Duran, who shrugged as her feline sapphire-coloured eyes locked onto Duran's. "She fought bravely," he said with a shrug. "It's one thing to take on an opponent that you know you can beat. It is another thing entirely to know your chances are low and to still take on that opponent. It would be a shame if such a brave woman were to die. Given more training, she could make a skilled swordswoman with such nerves." Lysica didn't say anything, simply wiping another tear from the corner of her eye, and before he could react, she took several determined steps forward. Her hand came up behind his head as she stepped into his space. A click sounded as their steel breastplates came into contact, as she pressed herself against his body so close he could practically feel her every curve. She pulled his head down, turning her slightly to the side as their lips met. She tasted sweet, with a hint of spices, like the pork they had for lunch, but better in every way, shape and form. She pulled away from him, and it took all of his self-control to not wrap an arm around her lower back and to pull her back in. She gave him a heated smile, her cheeks dark, before she turned and walked back into Solvi's room. Was it just his imagination, or did her hips sway more than usual? "That," Michaeline said with a laugh-turned cough, "might have been the single most expensive kiss ever purchased." Duran didn't take his eyes off the door that Lysica had just passed through. "It was worth every goddess damn coin," he responded, his voice rather husky, even to his own ears.